Hi, and welcome to this funeral planning overview presented by the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Pennsylvania. My name is Isabel Knight, and I'm a volunteer for FCA of Pennsylvania, and I'm going to give you an overview of, how to go about planning a funeral and what your rights are as a consumer, and a basic overview of pricing. So let's just start off by talking about why funeral planning is so important. So, a funeral is one of the most expensive things the average consumer will buy after a car or a house. But people know way less about funeral planning than, house buying. So, there's also the issue of when you're typically going about buying a funeral and, getting funeral products and planning it, you are in a state of grief because people typically don't pre-plan. So you will often make these stressful last minute decisions. You're really open to kind of emotional manipulation by funeral directors, which is not to say that all, funeral directors do that, but it is a for-profit business. So it's easy for people to kind of exploit that emotional aspect. So despite all of this, less than a third of people ever actually pre-plan their funerals. And, even then, most of the time they don't know what funeral services they need and what their rights are, and what prices to expect. So let me just go into part of why that is by talking about the current funeral environment. So right now, there's an oversupply of funeral homes in almost every state. As you can see in this chart here, each of these states has around 2 to 3 times as many funeral homes as they actually need based on how many people are dying in those states every year. And part of the reason why that is because it's really difficult to find prices. The prices are not advertised on most funeral homes' websites, and the way to get it is if you go in or if you call, and even when you call, it can be difficult to get funeral pricing. The other issue is that consumers don't shop around. Now, what's counterintuitive about this is that you would think that having more funeral homes would result in lower prices, right? Because there's more supply. But this almost defies the law of economics because, consumers are not shopping around and comparing prices, so it doesn't drive the price down. In fact, what allows them to, for what allows there to be so many funeral homes is the fact that they can kind of charge whatever they want. And that's exacerbated by the fact that we don't talk about death. Death is a very taboo subject. And so you're way more likely to talk about, oh, yeah, I had a great deal on this car, but that doesn't necessarily translate into, like, most people don't talk about getting a great deal on their mom's funeral or cremation, right? So that's a huge issue that contributes to, this oversupply of funeral homes. So I'm basically going to give you an overview of the two main methods of disposition, which is burial and cremation, and talk about the prices of each. So for a full service burial, or what most people or most funeral homes will refer to as a traditional burial, the total will be around $13,000 on average. And that includes the basic funeral charges, a plot, a vault, which is basically a concrete liner around the casket in a cemetery, the opening and closing of the plot, and a headstone. On the other hand, compare that to cremation, which is significantly cheaper. It's around $2,395 on average, and that's for a direct cremation, which is basically a cremation without any other services involved. And obviously that's way more than what the actual funeral home is being charged by the crematory, which is typically only $200 or $500. So it's still a significant markup, but compared to a burial, it's definitely your cheaper option. Now, I'm just going to give you a really quick overview of the Funeral Rule, which is the one federal law that really governs and regulates the funeral industry, and it's enforced by the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, and it has 10 parts. So the first part is that you are entitled to buy only the funeral arrangements that you want. A lot of the time, people will do this on religious grounds, but anyone is able to deny, funeral arrangements that they don't want. You're also entitled to get pricing information over the phone. So if you call them and ask for prices, they're legally required to give them to you. I like to ask if they can also email it to you, but they're not legally required to do that. When you go in person, you're also entitled to get a written itemized price list that you can take with you. And you're also entitled to see a casket price list before you actually see any of the caskets. And the same goes for the, burial container price list or the price list for those vaults. You're also entitled to receive a written statement of everything that you buy before you pay, so basically an invoice. And you're also entitled to a written explanation of any crematory or cemetery regulations or requirements, so that you're not caught off guard. And you are also entitled to an alternative container instead of a casket, which basically is just a fancy word for a cardboard box, which is, the cheapest option generally. And you can provide the funeral home with your own casket or urn without being charged a fee or any kind of penalty for doing that. And lastly, you're entitled to deny embalming. So again, that's often a religious thing, but you're not required to embalm legally. That's like a myth that a lot of people often believe, and sometimes funeral directors will say that, but that is not legally something that they can require you to do. Now, that's not to say that there won't be some funeral homes that require an embalming by their own funeral policies to have a viewing, but they can't tell you that an embalming is required by law, because it is not. So this is just a basic overview. I also have videos on pricing and the environmental impacts of, different methods of disposing of bodies, which I will link in the description. But if you have any other follow-up questions, definitely feel free to reach out to the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Pennsylvania. The information is listed here. And, if you have any particular questions on your specific situation, we're happy to answer questions about that. So hopefully this was helpful, and thank you for watching.